In 1999, I was a careless student in Mersin, in what was then the Toroslar municipality, in the Akbelen neighborhood. The high school I attended was called Ghazi High School, and our house was about a 40-minute walk away. I say a walking distance because my classmate Mustafa and I used to walk to school together. Mustafa and I had known each other since the first year of high school, and we lived in the same neighborhood. We were very good friends, and even after all these years, we're still very close. Back then, we weren't particularly interested in our studies, our main focus was on playing Atari games. At that time, the internet and computers were not common, so it was all about Atari. As soon as school ended, we would head to the local arcade, carrying Atari cassettes in our pockets and even trading cassettes during class. The shop windows of the local flea markets were filled with Atari cassettes of various types, single game, 4-game, multi-game cassettes, all of them fueling our dreams. Especially the single-game cassettes usually had excellent games. From Akbelen neighborhood to Ghazi High School, there were municipal buses like Osmania Akbelen and Demirtos Akbelen, but we preferred to walk to save the money our parents gave us for bus fares and used it to buy more Atari cassettes. In fact, that year, I had saved enough money to buy a second-hand Atari from a boy in our class. Our route to school involved walking through the city cemetery. To save time, we usually took a shortcut through openings in the cemetery wall. There were 2 gates to the cemetery, one on the Akbelen side, our side, which was always locked, and the other at the opposite end that was usually open. We had paths through the wall at various points, large enough for a person to pass through. When we entered the cemetery, we'd usually choose the shorter path, which took about 30 minutes, as opposed to the longer 40-minute route around the cemetery. The cemetery was quite large, surrounded by walls that were about 2 meters high. There was a security checkpoint and a morgue near the open gate on the other end. Sometimes the doors to the morgue would be left open, and we could see the marble tables used for washing the deceased. There were also 2 similar structures outside the morgue, right in front of its door. One day, as we were heading home from school, I sensed a disturbing odor about 300 meters before reaching the cemetery gate. The smell intensified as we approached the gate. Before long, Mustafa commented on the smell, and I suggested that it might be coming from dead animals like cats or dogs in the vicinity. As we reached the gate, the stench became unbearable. I remember it being the most intense and unpleasant odor I'd ever encountered. We could hardly breathe, and we started running, but we had no idea of the source of the smell. As we passed by the morgue, we saw 2 men in white clothing and masked faces working around a large, pitch-black object on a marble table. It was a human corpse, but it was clear that it had been there for a long time. The tissues had decomposed, and the body had turned pitch-black and swollen to a massive size. Even after we reached the other side of the cemetery, the smell still lingered in our noses, and each breath felt like it was decaying our lungs. We sprinted until we reached the far end of the cemetery and climbed through the opening in the wall. The smell still haunted us even after we had left the cemetery. It was a horrific experience, and I couldn't eat that night. Our school route was sometimes dangerous, as we'd encounter thugs and drug addicts who would rob and assault people, especially in isolated areas. We had heard stories in the neighborhood about such incidents, and we had our share of encounters with these people. One evening, as we were walking through the cemetery, we spotted a group of 5 or 6 addicts about 100 meters away. They started running towards us when they saw us. We couldn't stand a chance against them, and we didn't carry any sharp objects. On the other hand, they were unpredictable and potentially dangerous. We rushed into the dark part of the cemetery, where there were high marble gravestones. We hid behind one of the gravestones, and we could hear them approaching. They searched around for a few minutes before giving up and leaving. That night, if they had caught us, they could have beaten us severely or even used knives or other sharp objects. we might have been killed that night. Despite all these incidents, we continued to pass through the cemetery every day, twice a day, as it was the shortest route to our school. Until that terrifying evening. It was a winter evening, and Mersin was known for its rainy winters, but a warm jacket would suffice. The day ended early, around 5 p.m., and the surrounding area was covered in dense fog. On that particular day, we finished school at 6 p.m. By that time, it was completely dark outside, and a thick fog had enveloped the streets. Mustafa, 3 other classmates, and I decided to visit the bazaar, also known as the KBR's Bazaar. We browsed the shops, traded Atari cassettes using the money we had saved, and bought new games. Afterward, we visited the arcade in a building across from Mersin's tallest skyscraper. We spent some time there and, later, the other 3 friends headed home. Mustafa and I still had a long way to go to reach our homes, with about half an hour of walking ahead of us. By the time we reached the Demiatos neighborhood, the fog had become even denser, and the streets were nearly empty. We crossed Demiatos and approached the cemetery. Mustafa suggested taking the path through the cemetery, while I hesitated, suggesting we take the longer route around it. The fog had reduced visibility significantly, and I had an eerie feeling about walking through the cemetery that night. Mustafa insisted on taking the shortcut, mentioning that we were already running late, and our parents would be worried. Reluctantly, I agreed to go through the cemetery. As we entered through the large gate, we noticed that a security guard was talking to someone at the guardhouse near the gate. We greeted the guard with a casual good evening, and he asked us where we were going at this hour. I couldn't recall the exact time, but it was probably around 7:45 p.m. I told him we lived in Akbelen, and were heading home. The guard didn't question us further and continued his conversation with the other person, so we walked on. The cemetery was lit by projectors, and the path ahead was well lit. However, the fog reduced visibility to about 50 meters. To the left were Christian graves, with large marble crosses and angel statues, while the right side had Muslim graves. The fog and the silence were eerie, and the occasional screeches of predatory birds echoed through the tall pine trees. While walking, we heard a noise from behind us, like the sound of a thick metal rod falling to the ground. We both turned around, and the fog obscured our vision. The strange part was that the noise seemed to have come from the direction of the guardhouse. We continued walking, not giving it much thought, and made it to the middle of the cemetery. At that moment, we saw a shadowy figure ahead, moving towards us. The figure emerged from the fog, and we could see it was a man dressed in black, wearing a black beret, and holding a long, shiny object that resembled a knife. He approached us quickly, and we could barely make out his facial features. Fear consumed us, and we instinctively started running in the opposite direction. We ran back to the gate we had entered through, and I didn't even think about the guard. As we approached the gate, we were horrified to see the security guard lying on the ground, motionless. Blood was pooling around his head, and his flashlight was still on. It was clear that he had been attacked and seriously injured. Mustafa and I were terrified and didn't know what to do. We had no choice but to continue running, so we ran through the open cemetery gate, and into the Demiatos neighborhood, which was still shrouded in fog. Once we reached Demiatos, we found a payphone and called our parents, telling them what had happened. Our parents, who had been worried about us, drove to pick us up from Demiatos. We explained everything to them, and they called the police immediately. The police and an ambulance arrived at the scene. We later learned from the police that the attacker had likely been hiding in the cemetery, and used the thick fog as cover. He had ambushed the security guard, injured him, and then pursued us. The guard survived but was badly injured. That night was one of the most terrifying experiences of our lives. We were fortunate to have escaped unharmed, but the incident haunted us for a long time. After that, we never took the shortcut through the cemetery again, even in broad daylight. It was a valuable lesson about the potential dangers that could lurk in even the most familiar places.